In our last episode, I went over all of the decks that I imagine will land between 0 and 55% win rates. Now let's start talking about the decks which I think are in the top echelons of Legends of Runeterra in the A and S tiers. As before, keep in mind that we naturally don't know what balance changes might hit heading into the beta, but this should be a good place to start if you're just trying to figure out what decks might fit your playstyle and what decks you might need to be on the lookout for. Alright, let's head into the tier list. Okay, so let's start by talking about Teemo Burn. This deck is a really cool concept, which revolves around using Nexus damaging spells and units in conjunction with the Puff Cap package, which hopefully trickles in the final damage needed to take home a win. There are two main versions of this archetype, one of which is Mono P and Z, and the other one splashes some Noxus in there too. The Mono deck also uses Ezreal to add an additional combo option, and even goes so far as to run shady characters as a way to make more copies of Puff Cap Peddlers. The Noxus version, on the other hand, is less of a combo list and more of a strictly aggro burn deck, using the damage Nexus on attack followers and last breath damaging ones too. The biggest difference though is the access to Decimate, which can be an extremely strong finisher. I'm of the opinion that some skew of Teemo Burn is actually very, very good and very well positioned in the metagame. Teemo is probably my pick for the most underrated card in the whole game from preview patches, and this is a shell that really suits him. I'm a bigger fan of the Noxus version than the monocolor one, and I'd actually rate that one an A tier, although I think the monocolor one is actually probably somewhere lower, maybe even down in the C tier, because it's a lot softer to a lot more matchups. By the way, the reason that I think this deck is really well positioned in the metagame, just to add a little bit more clarity, is I think that there's a lot of decks that cannot deal with just burn to the face. There's a lot of decks that will not be able to outspeed this one. Alright, so this name is a little goofy, but basically we're talking about Shadow Isles plus Piltover and Zon. As you probably know, Shadow Isles has by far got the best removal options in Legends of Runeterra. Lots of this removal is also targeted removal, and that means that Ezreal can get a lot of mileage out of this color combination. On top of this, Heimer just also enjoys in being in a deck with lots and lots of spells, and so playing in a control shell makes sense. Piltover and Zon, of course, are no slouch themselves with removal, so between the two colors, these spells matter champions have a lot of synergy. One of the biggest reasons to be in a Piltover and Zon deck is Karina Varaza, which is an excellent double threat of board clear and a clock, and this deck is well suited to leverage her. The list that I'm showing on the screen right now is pretty untuned in my opinion, missing a lot of what makes this archetype so strong, right? Such as the Harrowing, Jury Rig, and Plaza Guardian. If someone makes a version that uses some of these cards, then I really do think it's going to be contender for an A tier control deck heading into the beta. Okay, so this next one is a pretty straightforward deck. It utilizes lots of good early to mid-game board control alongside some very efficient mid-game threats. If the game goes long though, it does have some bombs to hopefully close things out before it falls behind. Thresh and Babbling Bjerg are great, redundant ways of ensuring that the deck stays on pace, and the sack outlets, Hapless Aristocrat and Cursed Keeper, are great enablers for some excellent removal with Black Spear and Rouse of the Sunderer, and stellar card draw with Glimpse Beyond. This is a list that I've not personally been able to see in action, and to be honest, based on the deck shown here, I'd personally describe it as more of a tempo and mid-range deck, but I'm going to call it tempo control because that's what its creator called it. I think this deck is probably a solid A tier list, to be honest, but I think it's probably a little too fair to ever truly get into the S tier. Enlightened Ramp is an archetype focusing on getting to 10 mana quickly, then either abusing the Enlightened keyword as a reward for ramping, or just playing big, late-game threats to try and overwhelm your opponent. By using Freylord for access to ramp spells such as Wording Stones and Catalyst of Aeons, this deck can easily reach a point where Karma becomes enlightened very early, in conjunction with crazy effects like Winter's Breath, Dawn and Dusk, and War Mother's Call. Ash is a great pairing with Karma, too. Firstly, by providing lots of tempo and control through Frostbite, but secondly, by being a good threat and clock in her own right, drawing removal and answers away from Karma, assuming that the Ash is able to be proactive early. This is another list that I do think probably needs some refining, and there's a bunch of different versions of it, but I did play against this list quite a lot in Preview Patch 2, and it always felt very, very strong. I'm of the opinion that the version which uses Emerald Awakener and Health Potion is best, but I'm not sure that anyone else has uploaded the specific version that I was looking for, so I've tried to recreate from my memory what I played against in Preview Patch 2 that I thought was the best iteration of this. This archetype, though, regardless of its permutation, gets a solid A from me. There's definitely something to this concept. Okay, so this archetype is interesting. It has elements from both Noxus Spiders and the Light and Shadows archetype that, spoiler alert, is coming up in a little bit. It's far more resilient than the former due to the addition of cards such as Vanguard Redeemer, Dawnspeakers, Remembrance, and Radiant Guardian, which are all cards that are insane at rebuilding after bad combat or after a board wipe from a control deck. It's unsurprising given that one of their focal points is the Elite Tribe, but Demacia has definitely got the best tools for including in a tribal deck, so I think it makes sense to pair them with Spiders. The most popular Spider decks during Phase 2 were definitely the Noxus and Shadow Isles ones, but the one that I found personally to be the most effective was this one. My win rate, in case you're curious, was 66.6% of games over 27 games, so very strong numbers coming out from this deck. The deck itself is pretty straightforward, but I think it does probably need a little bit more tuning. I think the archetype is probably an A-tier deck due to how fast, resilient, and consistent it is. Reanimation effects are both prevalent and extremely strong in Legends of Runeterra. One of the cards which is best equipped to abuse this landscape is Anivia. By creating ephemeral copies of her with Splinter Soul, the copy will evolve at the start of the following turn. Ramping into your Anivias with an Oblivious Islander is a consistent way to ensure this happens early on, and depending on the exact list, you can add even more consistency in draws by using Entreat. On top of this, when Anivia dies, resurrecting her using Mist's Call, the Rekindler, or Chronicler of Ruin can be an easy way to double the number of copies that you have on the board. All of this combined makes it relatively easy to create massive boards of leveled up Anivias which are sticky and likely wipe the opposing board every other turn when you attack. Zombie Birds is the first deck from Legends of Runeterra that I featured on my channel. At the time, I was under the impression that no one else had yet discovered how broken reanimation and duplication effects were, but it does seem that that was inaccurate. This deck is definitely extremely strong. Although I don't actually believe Anivia to be as broken as much as the player base does, I personally think that Splinter Soul and Rekindler are the actual culprits. Certainly, regardless of all of that, this deck is definitely S tier. The Rekindler is hands down one of the most overtuned cards in Legends of Runeterra. I can't see a world where it remains unchanged heading into the beta, but this archetype is probably still worth checking out depending on how severe its changes are. There are a number of different lists in this archetype, but I'm just going to talk about the one that I personally playtested most, which was a Hecarim and Zed rekindling list. Given how much pressure these champions both provide, being able to continually reanimate them is a potent way to get tons of value. The key thing which makes the card so good here is that the Rekindler's effect is on summon, meaning that you can actually have it trigger by using Chronicler of Ruin, Splinter Soul, or Mist's Call on, in addition to playing it from hand. The cool thing about this particular list is that we're also using Navori Conspirator as a way of returning the Rekindler to our hand for more plays, as well as Fading Memories for a similar kind of effect. In addition to that, you can actually use both of these bounce cards or copy creation cards with Oblivious Islander and Inspiring Mentor for a lot of value there too. When you're playing this deck though, be very careful not to lose all of your Rekindlers before one of these combos comes online. You can essentially outvalue and outlast any other deck, maybe other than Atrocity control, but not if you run out of the rekindling effects too early. Because of the immense value that you have access to when playing the Rekindler, you're effective against both control lists, which obviously try and remove all of your things, but can't in this instance, as well as against aggro and mid-range decks, where our trades just don't hurt us nearly as bad as it hurts them. If you're curious, the version that I'm showing here that I played in Preview Patch 2 had an 82.6% win rate over 23 games, which is incredibly high. I believe the whole archetype to be S tier though, not even just this permutation of the list. Okay, so a lot of other people call this deck Hecarim Chariot, but I'm going to call it Ephemeral Tribal because I think that fits it a little better. Zed and Hecarim have, of course, a number of combinations that work well, but one which was absolutely everywhere, you could not get away from it during Preview Patch 2, was the Soul Shepherd plus Shark Chariot archetype. This archetype always aims to get value out of its ephemeral units by having Soul Shepherd on the field, and then using Shark Chariot too, so whenever you go aggressive with those units, you get huge damage swings. Alongside this interaction, the deck also normally runs some cards enabled by your things dying. Depending on the version, some combination of the Rekindler, Phantom Prankster, Black Spear, and Rasa the Sunderer. This deck also gets to use one of the best removal cards in the game, in my opinion, which is Deathmark, a card that makes it very easy to turn your undercosted ephemeral units into persistent threats while also clearing a path. There's a bunch of different SKUs of this archetype, and I've listed a few in the description and in the transcript, but I think the aggro variant is probably the best one, as it can really set a blistering pace with the right draw. Depending on the variant, I think this one probably falls somewhere between S and A tier. I think the aggro one is almost certainly S tier, but I think some of the more combo-y ones that use things like Dawn and Dusk are probably more like A tier. Okay, so returning to another one that I've covered on my channel already, Light and Shadow is an archetype that utilizes Lucian and Senna alongside many of the sacrifice effects, such as Ravenous Butcher, and the outlets, such as Hapless Aristocrat, from Shadow Isles to try and flip Lucian as early as possible. The deck is essentially an aggressive deck, but by getting so much value from so many of your sack effects in the early game, it also has quite a tempo feel to it. Because Lucian and Senna can flip off of one another in addition to Lucian flipping off of any 4 other allies dying, cards such as Splinter Soul and Chronicler of Ruin can ensure that you flip them even when dropping them in the mid-game. And by having fast speed sack effects, cards such as Avalanche don't actually necessarily wipe a board of Senna plus Lucian, meaning you're often able to bait the opponent into a very poor use of damaging removal. One other really cool interaction of this deck is that by using a card such as Splinter Soul and then attacking with a Lucian and a Senna, if you use that Splinter Soul on one of those two and place it first in the combat order, the subsequent one of the other one flips, which can really surprise people, and to be honest, I think it's part of the reason why my win rate was just so obscene with these decks. This deck is nuts, and it's definitely one of my favorite brews, and consistently an archetype which put up ridiculous win rates. I actually am going to play you an intermission clip of just how crazy things can get with this one. Okay, so unfortunately the audio bugged out when I was recording this clip, but essentially I just hopped forward a little bit into the game to not that far into the game. As you can see, we don't have a lot of mana crystals, but we are swinging in for a ton of damage regardless. We have 2 of the ephemeral versions of Lucian and Senna, which are able to flip each other and make sure that we just hit him for a truckload. So very, very fast, aggressive deck, as we were talking about in the top decks list. Let's head back into that discussion. Yeah, this one is definitely S tier. This deck tries to utilize both the strongest early game aggro champions, Lucian and Zed, alongside ephemeral and recurring units to flip Lucian early and swing in for very heavy damage. Because our opponents are very likely to be trying to remove our threats, and we have ephemeral units who are doomed to die, Vanguard Redeemer is able to be ran as a 3 of in this list. This means we have way more effective card draw than other ephemeral aggro lists, drawing us hopefully into more gas than the opponent can deal with. We're also, of course, in Ionia, which means we get to run Deny. Seeing as our early threats are better than basically what any other aggro list can run, the biggest thing you'll need to worry about it is spell decks, and Deny covers those. Okay, so this was another brew that I had with an obscene win rate and play volume. It had a 78.5% win rate over 29 games. Time will tell, but I'd be ignoring good data if I put it lower than S tier. Okay, I've been looking forward to chatting about this one. Atrocity list is a list which plays far more like a Magic the Gathering deck than any other I've played in Legends of Runeterra, the specific deck in question being a say-go control deck. This list relies on Commander Ledros and Atrocity as its primary win condition, enabling you to kill the enemy very quickly, assuming you're able to force in just 3 damage early on, something which is incredibly easy to do using the Undying and Shadow Assassins. Because the list isn't very reliant on getting damage onto your opponents, it has the unique liberty of being able to run almost entirely control spells, and being able to run them in a far higher volume than most other control lists. River Shaper is the unsung hero of the deck, allowing for you to consistently thin your deck while also providing a big threat in the right matchups, as its card draw is repeatable, unlike something like Avaros and Sentry. This deck was a late discovery for me in Preview Patch 2, and one which I actually had quite a tough time figuring out the kinks of. Once I did though, the deck put up pretty insane win rates, and I almost never found a game I felt like I couldn't win. I'm pretty sure this is actually just the best deck in Legends of Runeterra out of all the ones I've discussed. We'll see when the beta comes back around, but it's S tier for sure. So I very recently uploaded an in-depth deck tech on this list too, but in brief, it is a deck that piles on lots of pressure early with Lucian, Senna, and Teemo, hopefully with standalone on top, but it also has a lot of late game value and inevitability with the Puffcap package. I had a pretty obscene win rate, 77.5% over 40 games with this list, which is definitely, relative to the number of games I played, the highest win percentage deck that I had. The biggest thing which I think makes this deck S tier is that in the same vein as Light and Shadow and Ephemeral Tribal, this deck has so much value potential even though it is so efficiently aggressive. Normally, if you're going to build a hyper-aggressive deck, you have to give that trait up, but these ones just don't. The kind of value here is unique compared to those others too, where the puff caps are basically guaranteed to end a game eventually. Honestly, the only truly unfavorable matchup that I can imagine for Lucian and Teemo standalone is Atrocity control, which is why I said that deck is probably my best list and not this one. Either way though, this is definitely S tier. Okay, so that wraps up all of the archetypes and decks I'm aware of. I'm certain there's plenty more that I am not aware of. I did intentionally leave out some things, such as the Pursuit of Perfection Cataclysm decks, but that's because I didn't really want to make an E tier. With that being said, if there's ever a sideboard in the game, maybe a card like that would make sense in the Miracle deck, for example. So really, I'm very impressed with Legends of Runeterra and the spectrum of things that are viable and interesting to play. It's such an early state. I'm interested to hear all of your thoughts. I know I've likely rustled at least some jimmies with a few of my assignments, so hopefully we can keep the conversation productive in the comments below. Keep in mind that anything and everything could change when we hit beta. Warmother Control was probably an A or S tier deck before the changes to She Who Wanders and Wording Stones, so any nerfs could really shake things up. It's one of the coolest things about Legends of Runeterra. Riot has proven that they are interested in keeping the game balanced routinely. As always, please like, comment, and subscribe, and tune in next time. I'm looking forward to making more videos for you guys coming up.